Welcome to the Youth Voice, a politics podcast giving young people a voice across the island of Ireland. Today we're joined by Minister Peter Weir, of the Education Department and Strangford MLA. So thanks for coming on, Minister.
Glad to be with you, Dermot.
So I suppose we'll get straight in. I suppose we've had a lot of information over the past 2 days or so over the exam situation for Northern Ireland. So one of the big things that people are kind of wanting to know, and it's something I've had a lot from a couple of different students, is a lot of students are teaching themselves certain A levels, the likes of further maths, which may not be offered in a school. They may be only really provided with, sometimes they'll be provided with resources, or they might be just sitting the exam in that school, but they're not getting teaching. Yeah. So because it is a centre assessed grade, how will they be getting their results?
Well, I suppose there's two options or two linked in, but those students have been, and sometimes those can also be people who are doing the exam who are maybe decide to go back to doing the exam later in life, for instance, in that regard. They would count as private candidates. So there's first of all the opportunity where if they've got particularly strong links in with a particular school, that level of assessment can be done. But whereas it was particularly important is that we've made available to schools, and also then will also be the case to individual candidates, of what we call an assessment tool, which is effectively the opportunity to do a level of a test. It can then be taken into account whenever that level of grade can be done. And the idea is that the school will collate any information they have on and any evidence that they have on it on any individual candidate. But what we're also saying is, because some schools will not want to do that, or maybe somebody doesn't have a link in with the school, what we're saying is actually schools, if somebody then is asking for that, and it may be in some cases for a private candidate, if they don't have particularly strong links in with the school, that's their one piece of objective evidence that the school has got to facilitate them doing that if that's a request from that. So CCA will work with all the private candidates to make sure that pretty much everybody can get a grade in that regard.
Brilliant. Another thing that I suppose has been raised is next year for GCSE students. I know it's probably early days to start thinking about next year yet, but will, especially for GCSE, and I suppose as well for A2 students, will the specifications be kind of cut the way they were this year originally?
It's likely there'll be some level of adjustments. We've got to scope out precisely what happens for 2022 and do that over the next few months. But yeah, there's no doubt that the GCSE students, A-level students have had a level of disruption to their education moving ahead into 2022, and that's got to be taken into account in some way. I suppose one of the things that creates a level of restriction for a lot of folk, for us on exams compared to almost any other subject, is we want to make sure that there's kind of a level playing field between students from Northern Ireland and other jurisdictions, so that our students are not disadvantaged, so that on the one hand they're not put in a position where it's much more difficult to achieve a particular grade in Northern Ireland, or alternatively where if a Northern Ireland exam was seen as some sort of something very easy to obtain compared to others, we don't want a situation where universities or employers think, well, actually that's not really worth it because it's come from Northern Ireland. So that's why in one sense we can't just do all these things entirely on our own. And that's also the case because particularly at A-level side of it, around about 20% of our students will do exam boards that are outside of directly Northern Ireland control. So that's why we've got to kind of, roughly speaking, keep on the same level playing field as other exam boards.
Absolutely. One of the other things that I suppose this is actually really personal to myself is I know initially, instead of cancelling exams, we had a cut course. It was where we were only going to have to do one of two modules. So I know for politics, we had the choice between the Northern Ireland exam or the UK exam. But now with that kind of out the window, because we're not going to be having exams, will we still be expected to, I suppose, study and be assessed by our schools on the full course, or was it just?
I think the any level of assessment the school would do. I mean, first of all, I think the idea is, even when we were cutting down what was required for the examinations, the idea still was that schools would still teach the other elements of the course where possible. I think the assessment, largely to some extent, the detail will be up to the school, but what they will look at, I suppose, and take into account is put particular weight where they've had that level of teaching. So it may be that they know that here's a particular part of the course that either wasn't able to be got to, or was really heavily disrupted by COVID. And so I think they'll probably particularly look, because the idea is that they're looking at what evidence can be produced, we leave that really wide to the school. So it might also be that students may want to take, well, here's something I did during remote learning. I think I want that as a piece of evidence, and obviously the school can take that into account. But if there's been sort of a level of reduced content, then that's what the school can assess on. There's no restriction, no damage done to any pupil, because what's able to be covered in a particular school will be less. And that can also be tailored to some extent to the individual student, because I think one of the things we appreciate is in certain instances, it's not just been the situation that since the January period when students have been fully off. We know that students, particularly in September to December, some went through that period and were entirely in school throughout the entire period. Others had different levels of disruption. But the idea, I suppose, is that schools can then take that into account whenever they're making a judgment. Sometimes where different students in the same class will have been at different times off.
Brilliant. Another one that I actually got from a parent was critically vulnerable children. So whenever we are hoping to get back, I know that it is hoped that we'll get back before the end of the year. I know I'm hoping so myself. But children who are, I suppose, who are critically vulnerable, and if they get the virus, they're at a significantly higher risk than the other children. Is there any chance of people like that who are in that kind of position to possibly either get the vaccine, or will they be in a position where they can just take part in a blended approach?
Well, look, I think that being in a position, first of all, taking a blended approach, we'll follow, we'll always be arguing for people to get the vaccine, but we'll have to follow what public health say in relation to that. I suppose what's said, in terms of those who can be directly in school, what public health have always said is that it's a very, very small category of really extreme clinically vulnerable children, a few hundred maybe across Northern Ireland, who are not advised to be in school. But for most who have some level of vulnerability, there's still a high level of safety that's there. And, in many ways, I know that the virus has impacted really devastatingly on a lot of young people's lives. I suppose the one positive is that, largely speaking, while young people can still get the virus, the chances of a young person suffering very significantly by the virus is extremely low. Sadly, there was one death, but we've had one person under the age of 20 has died in Northern Ireland with the virus, and that person wasn't in school in that regard. So it's where they identify people that are really extremely clinically vulnerable rather than just have a level of vulnerability.
Absolutely. Another thing that I know there's quite a lot to get through, but I know that the executive said we won't be back before the end of March, or before the 8th of March. Mm-hmm. Will we be back before the end of the year, do you think? Or is it?
No, I think I would hope so. Certainly, I would like to see, I think the aim is to see students back in March. That will just kind of depend upon ultimately what the public health advice is. Probably will be decisions made roughly about halfway to 2/3 of the way through February, because we're trying to balance out the certainty of where we are in terms of the virus, with also giving people a bit of notice and trying to get that balance right. And obviously, health of the Lord said that as well.
Brilliant. Another thing that I suppose isn't exactly the most positive is from the Secondary Students' Union of mm-hmm. Northern Ireland. They have the thing they wanted to ask was that they feel they haven't been engaged with by yourself and the Department of Education, and they were wondering, is there a reason for that, or is it just down to timing?
I think from that point of view, we try and engage things, but we try and engage where possible on at times when it comes to, say, examinations, whatever. We've been in contact at times with various schools. We've got groups of students together in relation to that. I suppose it's about actually trying to get a range of voices rather than maybe one organisation, because I appreciate that they'll represent quite a few students, but it's not as if, I suppose, everybody in secondary school has a vote and then elects a representative forward in that regard. So we want to get a reasonable sample of students rather than simply people putting themselves forward in that regard.
Brilliant. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was, obviously, the Education Authority has, your party, I suppose, nominates members, as does the other parties. Your party nominated Nelson McCausland, mm-hmm. and he is now in a senior position within the Education Authority. And recently enough on Facebook, he has been sharing extremely offensive, I suppose, articles relating to conversion therapy. I was just wondering, is that really acceptable from a government party?
Sorry, there's been I think a level of misconception. I mean, first of all, no, he's not been sharing articles about conversion. He's been shared an article about somebody who was converted. That's different from conversion therapy. Somebody who has had a sort of a religious experience in terms of being converted. he hasn't commented at all on conversion therapy, and I think sometimes these things gain a level of momentum and connection with that when they aren't actually true.
I suppose actually going on from that, there was a vote. I think it was today, or it was certainly during this week in the health committee regarding conversion therapy. Will the DUP be continuing to, I suppose, to oppose conversion therapy and condemn it?
Well, yeah, I don't think we certainly don't support conversion therapy in that regard. And I mean, I don't know precisely the ins and outs of what was said at the health committee, to be honest on it, but it's not something we support.
Brilliant. I think that really wraps it up. I think thank you for coming on. I know it was a bit
Thanks very much.
short, but thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to putting this out. Thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.